Yeah. No!
So I finally got around to Mirror's Edge Catalyst. I followed this game really closely before release because I came out of the original game thinking that it set up a lot of potential for a sequel, so I was really keen for this game. Like it always does, life got busy, so I didn't actually end up playing it until now. I made a review of the original Mirror's Edge a while back, and if you haven't seen it, here's an overly reductive and dismissive version of that review to save you the click. I present to you the pros and cons of Mirror's Edge. Here's what we're gonna do. I'm going to alternate between these pros and cons and see how Mirror's Edge Catalyst handles the same thing in order to create a similar chart for it. Let's get started. Mirror's Edge was a beautiful game. Probably the most noteworthy thing about it was indeed its art style, and the same thing can be said about Catalyst. Catalyst doesn't have the same heavy use of whites and bold colours as the original game, instead opting for a less blinding palette most of the time, and I don't have any problems with this. Both games look stunning. Catalyst's City of Glass is much more futuristic than the original game's world. Drones populate the skies, citizens are all implanted and monitored by corporations, and a lot of the major plot points revolve around sci-fi tech stuff. Where the original game felt like a dystopian interpretation of the modern world, Catalyst feels like a sci-fi futuristic version of the same thing, with a lot of the themes being taken to extreme lengths. I think it loses some of its groundedness with this change, but it's still such a novel and unique world. With the floating orbs, the enemy health bars, the new heads-up display, the array of side missions, and the map, Catalyst feels a lot more gamey than the original. I feel that some of the first game's stylistic elegance, and again its groundedness, is lost because of this, but this isn't something that will bother everyone. The sound design and the soundtrack are both outstanding. The tracks perfectly complement the atmosphere, though they could have seen some heavier use in-game. I often found they got lost in the background or didn't play often enough, but some messing with volume sliders can mitigate this. Mirror's Edge Catalyst is again a very stylish audio-visual presentation with a fascinating game world which holds a lot of potential. I might not like the world and style quite as much as the first game, but it's still definitely a pro. Mirror's Edge's story was rubbish. From its writing, to its voice acting, and from its characters to its awkward hugs, not once did the story click, resulting in a bland narrative which squandered any potentially interesting use of the world. Somehow it's just as bad in Catalyst. For no discernible reason, this game is a reboot because rebooting a series after one game makes sense, and with a fresh slate they screwed up in basically the same way. Attempts to inject the characters with some personality comes off as juvenile, and for the majority of the game the storytelling feels more like an information dump. Again, the bulk of the storytelling is told through earpiece dialogue and cutscenes, though thankfully the cutscenes are regular in-engine affairs instead of those weird cartoon things we had before. Faith has complex relationships with all the characters aside from a few, and she seems to identify with them in ways that I don't completely understand as a player. She's motivated by these characters because she trusts them, and when things inevitably go wrong, she gives it her all to save them, but I couldn't care less about any of these characters because their introductions are inexistent and characterizations one-dimensional. There's a cutscene late in the game where Faith completely breaks down crying and begging for help from another character, and it's the single most jarring moment of the entire story. If you cut this scene out of the game and showed it to someone who's never even heard of Mirror's Edge, this would probably have the same emotional impact as it does for someone who has played the game and has context. The perfect word for this story is uninvolved. It feels like you're watching this story play out from afar rather than experiencing it for yourself. A lot of plot device jargon is dropped on you throughout the game, and it's often explained over Faith's earpiece during gameplay. The problem with this is that it's often hard to pay any attention to that dialogue for obvious reasons, and on top of that, if you fast travel and hit a loading screen, it cuts off the dialogue completely. This culminates into situations where you may struggle to remember what anyone is talking about or what you're actually doing, but hey, maybe I'm just stupid. Catalyst certainly treats me like I am. We'll get onto that later. Towards the end of the game, glimpses of a decent story start emerging. There's a subplot involving Faith being separated from her sister as a kid when her parents are killed, and when this ties itself back into the story, there's finally something to identify with. Unsurprisingly, this thread is poorly explored, and after an awkward sisterly fight takes the place of an awkward sisterly hug, the game ends on a stupid cliffhanger before it ever feels like it gets going. So in short, the plot is definitely a con. Everything surrounding the plot is also a con. It's baffling that they didn't do anything that much better this time around. It's a story that needs good exposition, characterization, and pacing, but it doesn't even have one of those things. Let's move on. Across the board, Catalyst's movement mechanics are better than the first game. Everything just feels smoother, and you can now vault off basically everything, and lo and behold, you can even roll under things. Also, the roll doesn't halt you to a complete stop, which just adds to it all feeling a lot more smooth and a lot more fun. Aside from all the tweaking, some new elements have been added. You can now spin around corners if you wall run into these specific poles, and partway through the game you get a grapple hook which you can use to swing across context-sensitive gaps. You can upgrade the grapple hook later on to retract up to specific spots and pull down specific walls. Using the grapple to traverse feels pretty fun, but it feels sorta like a tool to make the level designer's job easier since it's always the best option. If the prompt comes up to use the grapple hook, then use it. All other paths are slower. Also, you need to come to a full stop to tear down walls, which is stupid because breaking momentum feels terrible and the game actively encourages you to keep momentum. What I mean by that is that you have this meter which you fill up by maintaining momentum and doing parkour. When it's full, something called Focus Shield activates, which they describe as Faith being able to dodge bullets, but really it's a typical video game shield. If you break momentum, the bar depletes and your shield is gone. So naturally, breaking momentum is not something you want to do in this game. Going back a paragraph, I mentioned upgrades, and here lies one of the way too many baffling decisions that found their way into Catalyst. The full upgrade tree is not just limited to the grapple hook, it's separated into 3 different subheadings: movement, combat, and gear, and you get XP to get upgrades by just picking up collectibles and doing missions. Way too many of the unlockable abilities are complete nonsense. The most blatantly stupid of them all is the roll. The roll, which you use to break large falls, is something you need to unlock using experience points. Granted, it's one of the first things you do unlock, but if you're into parkour, isn't the roll the very first thing you learn how to do? How the fuck did Faith just forget how to roll? Did she never learn it in the first place? Why am I forced to mess up every landing at the start of the game, and why did they take a mechanic from the first game and hide it behind a skill tree? This isn't even the only time they do that. The 180 quick turn is another upgrade which you should be able to do by simply moving your mouse, but can't from some positions because your view gets locked. Also, the ability to wall ride jump into another wall ride is locked, which is just as disabling. This entire skill tree doesn't make any sense. Why are they holding back basic abilities behind unlockables in a skill-based game? You should learn the abilities by learning the abilities, not by unlocking them. In an interview with GameSpot, this is what a senior producer of Mirror's Edge Catalyst had to say about the upgrades. The RPG element is really about allowing the player to engage in the tools because it is a unique way of interacting with the world. The quick turn is a slightly more abstract tool and people didn't use it as much in Mirror's Edge. We've seen a distinct increase in people going, "Oh, I've got this? How do I use it?" It's worked into people's movement language much more successfully as a result of doing that. So basically it's all about treating your players like they're toddlers by introducing immensely basic mechanics to them via a drip feed, because apparently we're too stupid to figure it out on our own. Also, fuck everyone who played and loved the first game, this is a reboot and loyal fans don't matter. Taking things down a notch, the movement mechanics are actually an improvement once they're all unlocked, so they're a pro. But the skill tree is definitely a con. Even though it doesn't take too much effort to unlock the basics, it's ridiculous that this system is in the game in the first place. To put it politely, combat in the original Mirror's Edge was undercooked. There were 3 ways to take an enemy out: perform a timed button press takedown, shoot them, or beat them down in hand-to-hand combat. The first 2 are fairly self-explanatory, and the hand-to-hand in concept was all about mixing parkour moves with attacks to deal the most damage. For example, sliding or wall running into a kick would deal more damage than just kicking an opponent normally. The problem is, it felt horrible to fight, and shooting or countering was almost always the better option because it was quicker. The combat was definitely something that was best avoided or quickly over and done with. The melee combat in Catalyst has some similar things going on in that you do more damage mixing parkour with attacks, and keeping momentum in combat is further encouraged with the new Focus Shield mechanic. The central idea behind the combat this time around is hitting enemies into things. To deal the most damage, you directionally hit enemies into each other or into the environment. This initially sounds like an interesting idea, but in any situation, there's no more depth than just hitting enemies into the nearest thing. A quick dodge mechanic has been introduced, which is just a small dash in any direction. It's useful for gaining momentum when you're stopped, and of course, dodging enemy attacks. Weirdly, it's spammable, so you can just use it to avoid most attacks, making combat too easy at times. There's also a new light attack which is used for hitting an enemy while running past them, letting you maintain momentum and keep going. I really like this mechanic as it feeds into the idea of avoiding combat rather than engaging in it. In a game about running, escaping from combat makes a lot of sense. Unlike the original game, there's no difficulty options in Mirror's Edge Catalyst, and the game is just way too easy. When you have momentum, you're virtually unkillable, so when the combat gets tough, the game just becomes an endless loop of running around in circles to build up shield, landing as many attacks as your shield can handle, and then repeating the process. Just watch this sped up clip of the final fight in the game. It's the embodiment of absolutely thrilling gameplay. It's hard to differentiate between Catalyst's 5 different enemy types. Some of them have more health than others, some of them have guns, and some of them are parkour masters, but they're all defeated in such a similar way that they sort of blend into one boring looking sci-fi security guy. That gameplay loop works for every single fight. Every time I was stuck in a fight, all I was thinking was, I wish I had a gun right now so I could shoot these guys and get on with it. And yes, you do get stuck in fights, but I'll get onto that later. So gun combat has been completely removed. When I first heard this news before release, I was cheering. The gun combat was so bland in the first game, but now that I've played this and thought about it some more, it really could have worked here. Hear me out. The original game had a slow-mo mechanic where you could slow down time for a certain length and the ability was on a cooldown. This mechanic isn't present in Catalyst, but if they added it in where you could toggle it on and off and you spent your focus shield meter on it, then this could have opened up some really interesting opportunities for shooting mechanics. Slowing down time to pop a couple of headshots during a wall ride just sounds like the most badass thing ever to me. The brilliant thing about guns is that you don't have to stop to shoot them. If they were in this game, you could run through the levels shooting at dudes without ever having to slow down for hand-to-hand combat. I really do think that this could have and should have been implemented in the game, and it would have been really fun if it was done right. It's not like DICE can't make shooters, but I guess it's just a missed opportunity. So the combat is definitely still a con. You could argue that it's better or that it's worse than the first game, but on its own, it just feels terrible and out of place here. Level design is listed twice as both a pro and a con. When it was good, it was multi-pathed, fast, challenging, and flowed really well, and when it was bad, you were stuck in rooms jumping between ledges or crawling through vents or turning valves. Basically, Mirror's Edge was good when it was fast and bad when it was slow. You can say the same thing about Catalyst, but its problems come in different forms. The most obvious and controversial change has to be the introduction of an open world, which comes with all the open worldy stuff you might expect, like side missions and collectibles, where for some reason you need to stop and let an animation play out for some collectibles. Where the side missions take place in the open world, the main missions are generally segmented and linear. Achieving a good flow jumping between buildings is genuinely quite fun and reminiscent of the original game. I found some of the side missions and time trials made good use of this world, providing some engaging paths through the city. However, I'm one of those people who enjoys the context and production value of the main missions, so I didn't get a kick out of the side missions. Instead, the open world was simply a hub world for me to travel between main missions, and for this purpose, it's absolutely awful. Take a look at the map. Faith is here, and we're trying to get her here. I'll give you a second. You cross this bridge, right? Simple enough. Well, you can't actually get anywhere on the other side of this bridge, so it's not the way, and there isn't any other obvious ways around. Maybe I'm missing something. After some confusion, what I did was turn on Runner Vision, which tells you the path there. And this is it. How was I supposed to know that this bridge isn't crossable, and how was I supposed to know that I could swing through this giant gap between buildings? There are so many dead ends and so much sheer confusion when getting from A to B in this game. After this incident, I switched on Runner Vision whenever I had to get around just because this world is so damn frustrating to figure out. This involved pausing the game, opening the options menu, and switching it on or off whenever I needed to. This sounds nitpicky, but it really adds up having to do this so many times throughout the game. And while we're nitpicking, why is it that once you get close to a main base, the path becomes so incredibly dull? This is just another one of those things that becomes so tedious after you find yourself doing it a dozen times throughout the game. As you go through the story, you unlock new parts of the map, so you never really get used to any of the routes, and it doesn't help that everywhere sort of looks the same. Runner Vision now both highlights important objects and shows the path as a trail in case just simply highlighting objects wasn't patronizing enough in the first game. This isn't a big deal by any means, of course, because you can just turn it off, but it feels like instead of designing a sensible world to travel through, they just gave us this trail to follow and we're done with it. You can fast travel to hideouts to make getting around much easier, which would be great, but for each hideout you need to engage in a little combat side mission thing to unlock the fast travel. So it comes down to deciding which you like less, traveling long distances through this city or putting up with the combat system. Both options are just as fun as the other. So what's the game like once you're in a linear main mission? Well, it never quite hits the same lows as the first game, but it never hits the same highs either. The main problem is that the levels are generally weirdly linear and unchallenging, but a lot of the time they flow pretty well. It really sucks how there's usually only a couple of options in any situation, and if there's more options, the best path that the designers intended is usually fairly obvious. The campaign is just way too easy. There's no point where the platforming is ever too challenging or requires complex inputs to surpass. Like one of the upgrades which was just a mechanic in the first game is the ability to tuck your legs in during a jump, but not once in this game was I ever required to actually use it. The difficulty curve is pretty flat and there's never a sense that you're overcoming anything. It's all just so unsatisfying. The final level is particularly insulting. It's cool because of the scale and the set piece, but it's so damn straightforward and easy. The last couple of hours of my recording got corrupted, so I replayed the last chunk of the game, and this particular level is just so badly designed and single-pathed. And don't get me started on the 3 different elevator shaft sections. This whole level is such an anticlimax. At its worst, Catalyst's campaign locks you in a room with a bunch of enemies where you need to take everyone out to proceed, and it even sends waves of enemies at you sometimes. I'm sort of in shock that they chose to do this. In the original game you can almost avoid the combat altogether, and trying to do that is one of the more fun ways to play the game, but here they force you into combat situations even though they implemented combat mechanics which encourage avoidance. I hate being forced to deal with this laughably easy trash tier combat system in a game where running away from combat is genuinely enjoyable. Even the loading screens tell me that it's best to avoid combat. This is just another one of those completely baffling decisions which weigh this game down.
Oh, whoa. Plastic! I need those doors open! Now! I'm doing like that. There's K-Sec everywhere! I said I'm doing like that. The doors are open. Here, they're open.
The challenge in this game comes from outside the main story. The side missions can actually be quite difficult considering they're often on a strict time limit. But again, if you're like me and you're not the kind of person who gets a kick out of side content, then this is sort of meaningless. It's a shame too, because like I said earlier, if you ignore the dead ends, traversing the open world can be really fun and reminds me of the good levels in the original game. Like the first game, Mirror's Edge Catalyst relies very heavily on its level design, and I hate to say it, but the level design is all around worse here. As ridiculous as it is that this is the case, the level design is just a con this time around. And that's Mirror's Edge Catalyst. Here's the reductive and dismissive pros and cons. Honestly, I only really did this to give myself a structure which helps with the writing, but hey, it was a fun little way of doing things. The original Mirror's Edge was a special game. It had its problems, but it was the kind of game you'd play and think to yourself, if they made a sequel to this, I bet they would nail it. But then, they went ahead and made a worse game. A much worse game. It feels like the designers of Catalyst didn't care for the original game, or they didn't closely analyze what worked and what didn't. Whatever happened, even though I enjoyed parts of Mirror's Edge Catalyst, I can't say that it was worth my time. This is a series that I want to love more than I do. These games have so much potential and take so many risks as AAA games, but let themselves down to a degree where the series might now be dead in the water. I hope it isn't. I hope it's a case of third time lucky, but I don't have any faith that it will be.